few months back, we did a video on CRISPR babies. Basically, these are embryos that have been genetically modified using a technique called CRISPR, which is basically kind of like a Swiss Army knife, we think of, in that you can cut out certain genes, you can put in certain genes, you can activate genes, you can turn off genes, and you can do this, well, now we've been able to see that you can do it in a way on the embryo level. So back in November, Dr. Gianco, he announced that he had done CRISPR gene editing on 2 embryos from parents that did not know he was doing this editing. And he modified the gene CCR5 in these embryos.
Right, and CCR5, we know that this is one of those proteins that's a cell receptor, so it sits on the membrane of the cell facing the outside, and it will fit like a lock into a key with certain proteins called chemokines that are important for sending signals to your immune system that it needs to activate and mobilize. So CCR5 sits on your immune cells ready to be activated. And this gene is also important because we know that HIV also uses this lock to break into cells.
So he thought by modifying this receptor and making it not there, that he could prevent these children from having the HIV that their father had. At least in this, when this came out, everyone kind of freaked out because there has been a moratorium on gene editing, kind of just, not a law, but people have just said we're not going to do gene editing on embryos because we don't know how it's going to work, and we think that there's going to be a lot of off-target modifications. And for he broke not only this moratorium, but ethically he didn't tell these parents what he was doing and didn't indicate, like, get their consent from them, which is huge in the field of genetics. We've seen lots of cases where consent has not been gotten in the case of Henrietta Lacks, and that is having repercussions to this day because scientists did not seek the proper form of consent.
He wasn't even very open with his university about what he was doing. Just the whole thing was quite secretive.
Right. And I think he said that he wasn't funded by the Chinese, but I think it's come out recently that he has been funded by the Chinese government to do this work. So that brings up more questions. But then going back to the science behind it, a lot of people asked is modifying CCR5 necessary, because in the case of HIV, a lot of times you can give the mothers drugs that they'll respond, and oftentimes HIV is not passed through the father, and he was trying to do gene editing to address the father having HIV.
Yeah. And recently we covered that story where people were able to modify the bone marrow. So why do you have to modify every cell in the body if you can just give bone marrow replacement?
Right.
So those blood cells that HIV targets are replaced with blood cells that don't have CCR5.
Yeah, because you don't know what if CCR5 is needed in the brain for something.
It is active in the brain. So I think the knockout mice for CCR5 that don't make this protein, I think they have enhanced intelligence. So
yeah, so that's another thing. Like, that came out later, and it's like, oh, maybe he thought about doing CCR5 because it is linked with higher intelligence, like knocking it out. So there are just a lot of questions involved in his study, and people were not happy.
It was also sloppy. Like the actual gene editing that he did, the kind of the rationale comes from, we know there are humans with natural mutations in this gene, so the main idea would be to make the same mutations that they have, but the mutations he made are completely different, so we don't even know what these mutations do in animal models. Would be the first step.
Right. And he claims that these twins have been born healthy, but we haven't really seen any papers come out for this, any research, just it's been his word of mouth.
Yeah, some people even question if this actually happened because there's no peer-reviewed paper that's been published.
How this relates to our story of today, there has recently been another scientist, Dr. Denis Robinov, who's a Russian scientist, and he, about a month ago, said he wanted to do gene editing in CCR5 in embryos. So basically doing the similar thing to what he did in the twins. Interestingly, Robinov, he said he wanted to seek government approval from Russia, and also use this on HIV positive mothers who do not respond to treatment. So that means their children are going to get HIV no matter what because they are not responding. So his initial reasons for doing this study are definitely more valid than He's. And he also claimed that he would post an article in bioRxiv, which for scientists it's basically like this preprint server, so we can read articles before they've been officially published. And in this article, he says it hasn't been published yet, but he said he's going to show how he's experimented with CRISPR to reduce the off-target effects. And he's previously said that he can delete a section of 32 bases of CCR5 and have that happen 50% of the time.
That's the exact same mutation that the patients have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. But a lot of the people in the CRISPR field are like, how is this possible? Like, what have you done to make this work? Because the people who discovered CRISPR are very skeptical of his claims at the moment.
Yeah, wait. Let's back up. You said 50% of the time?
Yeah, only 50%. So
that's actually very good for gene editing in embryos.
Mm-hmm.
He's tested it in embryos, or?
I think that's what he said.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really hard to do CRISPR in stem cells.
Yeah, and it's like people are wanting to do this in human beings, but if it only works 50% of the time, which is good, that's like, wow, that's still kind of crazy odds there. 3 days ago, Robinov came out with another statement saying that he doesn't want to do CCR5, but he instead wants to prevent deafness of babies born of parents who have a recessive deaf mutation, which means that their children will be deaf. Parents, they have a recessive mutation in the GJB2 gene. A lot of these parents, they kind of find each other because they're deaf and they relate to that. So if they both have this mutation in this gene, it will be passed on to their children because it is recessive. Mm-hmm. So Robinov said he's found 5 couples who want to do CRISPR on their children, on their future children, to prevent the deafness. And he said he wants to seek approval from Russia before he goes ahead with anything. But scientists in general still want a moratorium on gene editing. But if Russia says he can do it, he technically can because it's his country. It's just he'll kind of get probably looked down upon from other scientists. But I mean, there's a lot of controversy with trying to edit something such as deafness, because for people who are deaf, it's not a disability. They learn how to do things in a different way, and they really have great lives.
Yeah, and they have community.
Mm-hmm.
So some people probably don't even think of it as a mutation that needs to be fixed. That's part of their identity and who they are, and why are you trying to fix this?
Right. What if one of their children is successfully edited and isn't deaf, but the other one ends up being deaf? And how do you rationale that in a family of just, well, we tried to do this for your one sibling, but now you're lesser than because you are deaf. There's also somewhat been a consensus in the field of that if you're going to do gene editing on an embryo, it should be for an embryo that would not survive otherwise. So in the case of people with cystic fibrosis, where it's very highly likely that towards their teen years of life they'll pass away because of cystic fibrosis, or other diseases that will be fatal, if you do gene editing on those diseases, that would make more sense because you're actually like saving a life.
Yeah, this just kind of opens the door. I feel like if Russia passes this, if you can gene edit to correct deafness, where do you draw the line? Hair color? Redhead?
I mean, I wouldn't do gene editing to get a red-haired baby, but that'd be kind of cool. Since it's Russia doing it, I could see it being like a race to gene edit. Mm-hmm. So like which countries can gene edit these diseases.
All over again.
It is, yeah, exactly. But at least Robinov seems to be more cognizant of the government's involvement and also other scientists.
It's nice that he's going through official channels at least.
Yeah.
At least it seems.
Yeah. But when he eventually does something, we will definitely